This has been a tumultuous week, concluding an extraordinary year. But Dafka, while we're in the middle of a crisis of political upheaval and global pandemic, I want to tell you about another crisis happening right here in our backyard, under the radar, away from any news or social media attention. And it is precisely because this crisis is so localized and outside the scope of our immediate concerns that I think it can be instructive of how to deal with larger crises that loom so large and directly over our lives right now. So let me take you to Tel Aviv. Of course, it's fitting that I would have to tell you about this online because whether you're abroad or in Tel Aviv itself, this more restricted lockdown we've just entered prevents us from actually traveling there physically and forces all of us to have to work that much harder to see another reality. That reality is the experience of some 25 churches of African immigrants and migrant workers in the Tel Aviv area. So a few weeks ago, my parents got a call from a good family friend of ours, Pastor Jeremiah Dairo, who leads a church in South Tel Aviv called Lift Up Your Head Church. The Tel Aviv municipality is closing down our church, he said. Our landlord has received notice that we are operating illegally, and he's been summoned to appear before the city's chief building inspector to explain why he shouldn't be prosecuted. Our landlord has been resisting pressure from the city for a while now, but now he's telling us this is too much and we have to leave. He says he doesn't want to go to jail. Now, we've known Pastor Jeremiah for quite some time now. His church has been operating for nearly 20 years there on Levanda Street in South Tel Aviv. That has a mix of workshops, storefronts, and residential housing. Levanda Street falls a block just north of the central bus station in the Neve Sha'anan neighborhood, which is famous for being one of the largest concentrations of immigrant communities in Israel, probably making up the overwhelming majority there. It really is a wonderfully diverse area of immigrants who've come here from Eritrea, Sudan, Ethiopia, the Philippines, Nepal, Sri Lanka, South America, and many more. Just to give a background, there are a little over 200,000 foreigners living in Israel. About half of them are migrant workers here on valid work visas. Another 200,000 have stayed after their visas expired. Some 30,000 are asylum seekers, having fled war-torn countries, mostly Eritrea and Sudan. And then there are nearly 60,000 who came on a tourist visa but decided to stay. Most of those are from the former Soviet Union, but they really have come from all over the developing world. So, as you can imagine, a huge percentage of these migrant workers are Christian, and they like to go to church. All throughout the day on a Shabbat, because it's their only day off, thousands make their way through the vastly secular Tel Aviv to services all over the city, and mostly there to the southern part of the city where Pastor Jeremiah has his church. In fact, just on Levanda Street, there are several churches all right next to each other. One of the buildings houses 4 churches, 2 on the first floor and another 2 on the second floor. It also just so happens that most of the churches on Levanda Street are African, Nigerian, Ghanaian, and others. There's also a Filipino church in this cluster, and further down the road, there's a Messianic congregation. In total, there are some 25 African churches in Tel Aviv, although there's no official listing anywhere. And if you've ever been there, it really is a gorgeous sound to hear the different styles of music and worship just billowing out of the windows as you walk along the sidewalks below. So you can imagine my shock when Pastor Jeremiah told me that it wasn't just his church that was under threat of closure, but nearly all of the 25 African churches. In fact, some of them have already closed down, and others have just days to respond to legal action taken by the municipality against them or their landlords. And for some reason, as of this moment, it is all of the African churches, but only the African churches that have been served notice. The Filipino church and that Messianic congregation on the same Levanda Street, for example, have not been sued yet, anyway. Actually, this isn't the first time these churches have been harassed by the authorities. A few years ago, Pastor Jeremiah was suddenly slapped with a 1 million shekel bill in municipal taxes the city said his church owed. It took a lot of time and money in legal fees for his lawyers to get that rescinded by proving that as a registered church, they were exempt from paying the Arnona tax, just like any other kind of house of worship. But over the years, many of the other churches too have had municipal authorities visit and make inspections and demand they make significant upgrades, like adding extra units or extra exits, refurbishing windows, whatever it would take to operate according to the city's building codes. But now these churches are told that those adjustments, adapting themselves to the building codes, are irrelevant, because now they're told their churches cannot operate in those buildings at all. The buildings have been zoned for commercial or industrial use only, the municipality claims. So the churches should have never been allowed to operate there at all and are therefore illegal. But there is something very suspicious taking place when every African church simultaneously in Tel Aviv is suddenly deemed to be operating illegally, when they've been allowed to operate there for 5, 10, 15, or 18 years in Pastor Jeremiah's case. And there's something reprehensible about a citywide campaign to single out the African churches exclusively. Now, I want to take a moment and slow this way down. I recognize I'm making some very serious charges against the Tel Aviv municipality. I'm suggesting the weight of evidence can lead one to believe that whoever is leading this effort in the city's bureaucracy may be motivated by racism against blacks, against Africans, and that they've chosen to seriously curtail their religious freedoms as a tool to diminish their presence in certain areas of the city. And there are two of several ways people can respond to an admittedly severe statement like that, both of them dangerous and destructive. What do I mean? Well, here's one way people sometimes handle criticism or fault they find in Israeli institutions or society, and that's to immediately assume the worst. People can identify real instances of abuse or injustice and use them as evidence to paint a much darker picture of the situation, one that is essentially false. An extreme example of this would be to say something like, well, this just proves the state of Israel and the Israeli people themselves are just as racist as the Nazis and doing what the Nazis did to them. So they'll take a real and truly unjust act and use it to tarnish an entire people or system. They've extrapolated the views of the few upon the many, or they might exaggerate the views of even those few. Then, instead of clarifying a wrongful situation, they end up distorting it and smearing the truth of it. In the best case scenario, they merely discredit their own credibility. But in a worst case scenario, they can promote racism towards Jews and even incitement to violence against them. And precisely because of today's context in which anti-Semitism is rife all over the world, distortion and slander like this has to be recognized for how destructive it is. Now, there is also a polar opposite response that others sometimes have in reaction to criticism of the kind I've levied against the Tel Aviv municipality, and that is to dismiss it or minimize it, precisely because of the fear of that slander. People might hear a criticism of injustice in Israel and say, a people who have experienced the worst forms of racism would not harbor racist views themselves, and therefore would not act unjustly in such a way. There must be some other explanation, either that the injustice cannot be so bad, or that there is no injustice at all. So they, in an effort to prevent a distorted image of an irredeemably racist society in Israel, they create another distorted image of a society incapable of racism or serious injustices. Often I think they hope that by swinging the pendulum the opposite way and portraying a purely positive picture of life here, they might restore that imbalance to a more realistic view. But a distortion isn't corrected by a further distortion. Distortion and slander is corrected by striving towards the truth, as uncomfortable and inconvenient as that may be. A dogged pursuit of the truth and a willingness to apply constructive criticism is a far greater defense against lies and propaganda than whitewashed propaganda of our own. So after meeting with 17 of the African pastors this Saturday, I came away incredibly inspired. They explained how they fully understood what they were facing. Contrary to what one so often finds among a people in crisis, they had no desire to wallow in victimhood or nurture a fear of some insurmountable monster. In fact, they were hopeful and determined. They described with nuance and sophistication how the situation is complex, how they recognized there were mundane technical issues to deal with, complying with contracts, building codes, and zoning regulations, and that these needed to be separated out and distinguished and not conflated with instances where they are indeed being discriminated against as Africans. And maybe the greatest sign in all of this, that they were not going to be swept up in either vilifying or whitewashing their adversaries, was their capacity for self-criticism. One pastor said, "We have to admit where we might have been a source of disturbance in the neighborhood. Some of our services are too loud. We have to do a better job of being sensitive of our neighbors." In actuality, they are one of the most positive influences in the neighborhood. Of course, I wouldn't be an objective judge of that fact, but the local police themselves have stated how thrilled they are with them. The police have many times expressed how appreciative they are of helping counter the influences of crime, drug addiction, and poverty in the area. They have an open invitation to visit the police station anytime they like. And considering it all, the pastor who ended our meeting in a final prayer prayed that however things turned out for them, they would trust in God. He prayed that he knew God would use this situation to build them up and strengthen them, no matter what the outcome. I wanted to tell you about this ongoing saga now, while we're in the middle of it, and it's still unresolved. On the one hand, so that you could be in prayer about it, but on the other hand, to serve as a guide in our approach to other controversial crises like these. So often the truth is the first to fall victim in cases like these, as we fall into our respective camps more worried about winning an argument about how this should be portrayed, rather than honestly and open-mindedly pursuing an accurate, nuanced understanding of the situation. Accurate and nuanced means we have to resist the urge to make grand, sweeping statements, that we have to constantly refine and reconsider our positions. I know, though, that this can sound like being evasive to some, the opposite of taking a clear, definitive, determined stand in the face of injustice. But we shouldn't fear that a careful handling of the truth will tarnish, even as it exposes the muck and mire. Consider the example Jesus gives us of not allowing the threat of defamation or slander to compromise his truth. He was a dinner guest at someone's house one evening when someone, a woman, approached him with a jar of perfume and began weeping and kissing his feet as she poured perfume on him. It isn't stated explicitly, but there are clear sexual overtones here. The dinner host says, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner. He is obviously incredulous that Jesus would allow himself to be put in a compromised position, to not do everything he can to at least avoid the appearance of evil. Jesus is indeed in a compromised position. It's expected that any rabbi or pastor worth his salt would absolutely extricate himself completely from a situation so potentially damaging to his reputation. But Jesus isn't worried about having to engage in damage control over his reputation. His primary concern is to resolve this intricate, complicated crisis with sensitivity. His reputation be damned. On another occasion, Jesus said, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by all her children, Jesus says. So as we seek to address injustices, may we seek the truth with confidence that the truth will triumph over distortion and slander, and that wisdom is proved right in the end.